Well, hello and welcome everybody to ICMDA webinars. I'm Dr. Peter Saunders, the Chief Executive of the International Christian Medical and Dental Association, which brings together at the moment 84 national associations of Christian doctors and dentists around the world, totaling some 60,000 Christian doctors and dentists. Well, today on ICMDA webinars, we've got Dr. Jay Smith back on the third of his series of 4 on understanding Islam. And today we're going to look at the life and work of Muhammad. And I can promise you there's a lot of new material here that you will not have heard before. So it's great to have you back again, Jay. And on this subject, Muslim tradition teaches that Muhammad was born in Mecca and then moved to Medina, both in Central Arabia, in 622 AD, important date to remember, 622 AD, and that during this period, Muhammad received the Quran and became the paradigm, it became the paradigm for the Islamic religion practiced today. But what do historical sources reveal? That's the question we're looking at. And this webinar is going to evaluate the historical record of Muhammad using evidence from the 7th century and before and comparing it with traditional teaching. Dr. Jay Smith has worked with Muslims since 1983. He's got 2 master's degrees and completed his PhD in Islamics in the areas of apologetics and polemics in 2017. Jay is one of Christianity's principal public evangelists and debaters to the Muslim world, and he travels extensively teaching apologetics for those exploring ministry to Muslims and engages the movers and thinkers of Islam on a weekly basis. He's the co-founder for the Fanda Center for Apologetics. He is also the director of MAPI, M-A-P-I, which is a new master's in the apologetics and polemics of Islam. This is coming out of Veritas University in California, and you can do it online over 2 years, Monday nights, and I can promise you that is a brilliant new program, and there'll be more information of that when we write to you after the webinar. But Jay, just a pleasure to have you back again today, and we look forward to more enlightening stuff on the history of Islam. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Peter. Let's get right into the PowerPoint. And as you can see, we're going to be looking at the importance of early Islam historically. This is another way of saying we're going to be looking at Muhammad. This is the newest research on the historical problems with Islam's origins, which is an area very few people have looked at. And that's why for many of you, much of what I'm going to say today is probably new. 3 areas that we are investigating in this series of lectures. The first one we did earlier was looking at Mecca, a historical assessment of Mecca. Today, we're going to be looking at a historical assessment of sources and early Islam, really looking at who is this Muhammad, where did he come from, and did he actually even exist, which is a huge question to ask. And then the next lecture will be on a historical assessment of the Quran itself. Now, that could be an entire series of lectures in and of itself. The Quran is such a big area, a big subject, but that will wait for later. Remember what we said earlier in the last lecture. Islam is completely dependent on 3 things: the book, the man, and the place. The book being the Quran, the man being Muhammad, and the place, Mecca itself. Those are the 3 things. You take away any one of those 3 and question them historically, and the other 2 come cascading down. Since these 3 areas are foundational to Islam, we should investigate them. But listen, I don't want to investigate them from what the people in the 9th and 10th century said. I want to go to the period where these 3 existed, the 7th century. In the place they existed, which means the central part of Arabia, known as the Hijaz. So let's continue by looking at the problem of sources. This is why, in some ways, this should have been at the very beginning, but I want to bring it in this lecture because before we move on to Muhammad, we need to look at where all our material concerning him and early Islam, where it all originated from. All right, so let's begin with the problem of sources. Where did what we know about Islam, about the book, the man, and the place, what are our sources? Here's the map that shows you what we're looking at. When you look at the central part of the Middle East and North Africa, according to the Islamic traditions, according to standard Islamic narrative, Muhammad's empire encaped that brown area that I'm pointing to right now. And that was the area. This is what Islam tells us. This is not what I'm saying. This is what Islam tells us. That area existed under Islamic control by the time he died in 632 AD. After he died, you have Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, the four rightly guided caliphs, and it moved into this area, the orange area. And that was about, we know that as the Rashidun period, the golden age of Islam, as Muslims tell us. And that was roughly a 30-year period from 632 to 661, when Ali was then killed at the Battle of Siffin, and Muawiyah, the first caliph of the Umayyad Caliphate, then took over and then expanded the borders during the Umayyad dynasty from his period, 661, up until 750, so roughly 90 years. It moved into what is the purple area. And that's what we're looking at. That's all I'm concerned with, is what you're looking at the map now. Really, I'm not concerned with the purple area. That's too late. Well, parts of the purple area, yes, but I'm more concerned with the brown and the orange area. That's where the story took place. That's what how Islam began in that area. So let's really zero in to that brown and the orange area. And let's look at a timeline, because this is what Muslims tell me. This is the only story you ever heard. This is the narrative from the standard Islamic narrative, from the Islamic traditions concerning Islam's emergence. Islamic traditions tell us that Muhammad was born in 570 AD in Mecca, that the Quran was revealed starting in 610 AD, and that in the 621 AD, in the middle of the night there in Mecca, Muhammad was woken up, told to get on the back of a winged horse by the angel Gabriel, and he flew up on this winged horse called the Burak up to Jerusalem, where he then ascended the seven heavens up to meet with Allah, and Allah told him to pray 50 times a day. He comes down to the fifth heaven. Moses is in the fifth heaven, and says, how many times did he ask you to pray? He said 50. So he says, no, go back and see if you can get it down. So he bounces back between the seventh and the fifth heaven and brings the prayers from 50 to 45 to 30 to 15, 10 down to 5 prayers. Once he gets it to 5 prayers, Moses says, okay, go back to earth. That's enough. That's why we have 5 prayers today. That happens in 621. In 622, the next year, he then leaves Mecca, moves up to Medina, which is just north of Mecca, up on the plateau. And there he then creates the Islamic Khilafah. The first Khilafah was then created under his authority in 622. In 630, he comes back and he conquers Mecca. So then he expands his borders, starts to move out, and through that whole central part of Arabia, he then takes under his control, and then he dies in 632. So that's Muhammad's life. From 570 to 632, this is what every Muslim knows. This is what you know. This is the only narrative that we have been taught. When he dies, Abu Bakr takes over for 2 years. He dies peacefully in 634, expands the borders beyond that central part of Arabia, up to the north and also to the west and the east. Umar then takes over after Abu Bakr dies, and he does the greatest expansion, pushing the borders all the way out to Afghanistan in the east, to Turkey in the north, and to Tripoli in the west. He is killed in 644, 10 years later. Uthman then takes over, and Uthman is the one that's best known as the one who then compiled the Quran in its complete form. So the Quran we have in our hands today is his, and of course that happened in 652. He is then killed in 656, and Ali the adopted son of Muhammad, then takes over, and he only rules for 5 years. All of these 4 men are there in Medina. That's where the headquarters is. That's where they're ruling. And then he is killed at the Battle of Siffin in 661 by Muawiyah, who then creates the Umayyad dynasty. So that is the story of Islam. There you have it on a timeline, visual, so you can see it. That is their story, not my story. But of course, that's the only story you have. Now, Islam was therefore fully formed in the Hijaz by 661. Here's the question. How do we know all of the above? How do we know everything that we're looking at? How do we know any of those instances or any of those historical events? Where does the material come from that talks about Muhammad's birth or the Quran being revealed or Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali? Where do we go to find out about all this material? You'd like to ask, right? Well, let's look. Let's put another timeline on and let's see what this timeline tells us. Now, according to what Islam tells us, this is this is still their material. I'm not making this up. Everything I'm going to be saying comes straight out of their traditions. This is what the traditions tell us, that Muhammad dies again in 632. We know that. And how do we know it? Because of the biography of Muhammad, known as the Sirah. And the Sirah was first written by this guy here, Ibn Ishaq. Notice his date when he died. He dies in 765 AD. Hold on a minute. Muhammad dies in 632. This is 765. That's 130 years after Muhammad's death. We get the first biography of Muhammad written down. But hold on a minute. This book here that I have in my hand, I don't know if you can see it. This is his book. This is the biography of Muhammad. This is what we're told. All of us are told that this is the book that Ibn Ishaq wrote. In fact, it even says Ibn Ishaq. There it is on the cover. But this is not from Ibn Ishaq. None of it is from Ibn Ishaq. It all comes from this guy here, Ibn Hisham. Look at his death date. He died in 833 AD. Ibn Hisham is the one that gives us the story of Muhammad. He claims that he takes some of what Ibn Ishaq says, threw out much of it because he didn't trust it, and only wrote down what he wanted. So really, the biography of Muhammad does not come from Ibn Ishaq. It comes from Ibn Hisham. So let's throw away Ibn Ishaq. Don't need him because we have nothing written by him. Now, there's another biography, Al-Waqidi. He dies in 835. But do you notice how late this is after Muhammad? All right, just look at the dates. Now, for Muslims, the Sirah is not that important. What's more important are the hadith. These are the sayings of Muhammad, and they were first written down by a guy named Al-Bukhari. He died in 870. Another one is Sahih Muslim. He died in 875. Another is Tirmidhi, 884. Ibn Majah, 887. Abu Dawud, 899. Nisai, 915. Before I get into that, those are the sayings of Muhammad. I have them in blue, a different color, so you can see them easily. And you notice that they are 240 years after Muhammad's death. But that's still not the rest of the traditions. You have two other forms known as the tafsir and the tahriq, the commentaries and the histories. And the first one to write that genre of material down is Al-Tabari, who died in 923. That's the 10th century. So the earliest we get of anything written about Muhammad or early Islam, about anything that's happening on the emergence of Islam, comes 200 years after Muhammad's death. I want to put up Abd al-Malik here because he comes in 692, and he is the one that introduces the name Muhammad. He puts it on the Dome of the Rock. He puts it on the inscriptions and also on the coins. We're going to talk about him later. That's 141 years before Ibn Hisham writes it down, but he has that intervening 140 years where Muhammad's name starts to take shape. But it's these people, the Abbasids, who come to power in 749, 750, who are actually the ones that give us the Muhammad we have today. They are the ones that introduce the narrative you all read today. And before their time, it was not the same narrative. Why? Well, because we're going to go back to what comes earlier than the Abbasids to find out what happened. Conclusion: Muhammad was revealed 84 years after the Abbasids created him, 141 years after he was first introduced, yet 201 years after he supposedly lived. Take that on board. That's a huge statement that I'm making, but I'm going to have to support it, aren't I? Now, that's not the only problem. Look at the distance and direction of these different authors. The Islamic traditions say everything happened in those two cities, Mecca and Medina, in the central part of Arabia on the western side. Yet all of the writers, the traditions worked in Baghdad, which is 1,200 miles too far north. Ibn Hisham, the one who wrote the Sirah, is from Basra, but he grew up in Cairo. He also did his writing in Baghdad, but you notice he lives over 900 to 1,200 miles away. Al-Bukhari, who writes the Hadith, is from Bukhara, which is in Uzbekistan. That is 2,600 miles away from Mecca, Medina. Al-Tabari, who wrote the Tafsir and the Tahriq, is from Tabaristan. That's 1,700 miles away from the Hijaz. Conclusion: none of the traditional writers lived or worked in Mecca or Medina. They were too far to the north of Mecca and came from the west and east of Baghdad. All of these northern areas are where the Abbasids originated from. So, looking at this northern hegemony, let's just repeat that, what we've said before. Come down again. Notice, when you look at this northern hegemony, the Islamic traditions say everything happened in Mecca and Medina. That's known as the Hijaz. Yet all of the writers of the traditions worked in Baghdad, which is 1,100 miles too far north. All of these northern areas are where the Abbasids originated from. Furthermore, all of the writers of the traditions worked in the 9th and 10th centuries. So, conclusion, they all wrote their material hundreds of miles too far away and hundreds of years too late. There it is, all in one slide that you can look at. That is the problem. They're too late and too far away to be authoritative. Now, do we not have the same problem with Christianity? No, we don't. Let's do the same thing and ask about the tafsir, the tahriq, the hadith, and the sirah of Jesus, because all four genres exist. Now, I'm going to step on some of your toes. I'm going to use the most liberal dates I can find just to make my point. So, according to our tradition, according to our New Testament, everybody agrees that Jesus died in 33 AD. We also get that from Tiberius. He died under the time of Tiberius. We get that from Tacitus, the Roman historian, who tells us the date. The book of Acts, which would be the comparable to the Tahriq, of the histories of Islam. The book of Acts is the history of the early church written by Luke around between 52 and 62 AD. That's 20 to 30 years after Christ's death. The Paul's letters, the tafsir, written between 48 and 65 AD, that's 15 to 34 years after Christ's death. Mark is where we get the sirah and the hadith, the sayings of Jesus, the hadith, and the story of Jesus, the sirah. He dies around 70 AD, so that's within 37 years of Christ's death. Matthew and Luke, who write also the sirah and hadith of Jesus, they die in around 80 AD. That's 47 years after Jesus' death. And then you have John, the last of the sirah and the hadith writer. He dies in around 90 AD, within 57 years of Christ's death. Within 29 to 57 years of Christ's death, we get the entire New Testament, which is the tafsir, the tahriq, the sirah, and the hadith of Jesus. There's the comparison. Note, all of these New Testament writers lived in the same place Jesus lived, and they either knew him personally, like Matthew and John, or they got their material from others who saw what he did and heard what he said. Can you see that difference? So, comparing Christianity to Islam, when were the earliest biographies and sayings for both faiths written? Well, Christianity, they were all written within 15 to 60 years of Christ's death. For Islam, 200 to 300 years later and hundreds of miles too far north. Which would you guess is more authoritative? As a comparison, if we had to depend on sources for Jesus, comparable to what Muslims are dependent on for Muhammad, Jesus would not begin to appear until the 3rd century. That's why the scholars are concerned. Why did it take so long? Were these people illiterate? No. Look at the cities. Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo. These are not illiterate cities. Where did these 9th and 10th century traditional compilers get their material? Can we trust it if it's so late? Shouldn't we go back to the 7th century and to the place where these events happen? Notice, for this talk, I'm only interested in the 7th and 8th century. I'm not going to waste my time with the 9th to 10th century or even later. What am I talking about? Remember, I said I asked the question, who created the biography, the first rendition, the first reference we have to Muhammad in a book form? And I said it was by Ibn Ishaq, but I said, no, not really. It's actually Ibn Hisham who wrote that book down. And there's the picture of the book translated by Alfred Guillaume from French into English. But there was nothing about Muhammad's life at all from the 9th century. So no, we have nothing from Ibn Ishaq. We don't even have anything from Ibn Hisham. So where did this book come from? Where did the Sirah come from that gives us Muhammad's life? It actually comes from this man, Heinrich Ferdinand Wüstenfeld, who between 1858 and 1860 is the man who went to 4 different libraries and museums in 4 different German cities. He was German himself in those 2-year period, and took out Arabic texts about this Prophet Muhammad, all coming from the Ottoman period. And he put it together and compiled the life of Muhammad. That's the book we read today, all written by Ferdinand Wüstenfeld, a German scholar, about 160 years ago. None of it can we trace back to Ibn Hisham from the 9th century at all. It's from the 19th century, 1,000 years later, then translated by Guillaume and others later on. There's another rendition that came out in 1967 from Fouad Seged, just from material that he found in Morocco. So the man who Muslims are dependent on to know who their prophet is or what he did is an elderly German linguist who wrote Muhammad's story 160 years ago, thus over 1,000 years too late. And it just makes my job that much easier. Now, let's go to the 21st century, why the scholars are so concerned. Islam, as we know it, they say, did not exist in the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years. The Quran probably was not revealed to one man in 22 years, but likely evolved over a period of 50 to 100 years. Conclusion, the history of Islam, at least by the time of the Caliph Abdul Malik and before, is a later fabrication.